Today, I thought I would just share a brief review of this fantasy novel, Gardens of the Moon, by Stephen Erikson, which I read over the last week. So I enjoyed this book a lot, and I definitely recommend it. I'm a big fan of fantasy, but I think a lot of fantasy fans will agree that it can be quite hard to find well-written and interesting original fantasy series. I tried this book because I'd heard it was meant to be pretty good and that the series was quite popular. I ended up enjoying it a lot. So the book is called Gardens of the Moon by Canadian author Stephen Erikson. It's the first in his 10-book series called Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is an epic fantasy series, a high fantasy series. So, in a nutshell, the series is set in a fantasy world, which is dominated by the Malazan Empire, which is a society inspired by the Roman Empire. So, some of the main characters in this book include soldiers who work for the Empire. And of course, this is a high fantasy book, so there's magic too. In the squad of soldiers, who are some of the main characters here, one of the members of their unit is a mage. So he's like a battle mage who has some pretty cool powers and causes magical explosions and all sorts of other crazy stuff. So basically, the book follows some of these characters and their dealings with the Empire, as well as some conflicts with the Empire, some plots that the Empire is trying to pull off, and then uprisings by some of the Empire's enemies and some countries that want to, throw off the imperial yoke. They are sent to a city called Darujistan, which is not yet under the Empire's control, and they are sent there to destabilize it. And along the way, they encounter all sorts of characters, including this pretty interesting guy called Anomander Rake, who is not human, but he is a spell user who lives in like a floating fortress. Yeah, the plot is very complicated and there's a lot going on. And I will admit, at first I found the book quite hard to get into because the book doesn't really explain too much or give you too much exposition, which is actually kind of a good thing because it just throws you into the story, but it can kind of leave you feeling a bit lost and not really sure what's going on, who these people are, what they're talking about. So I actually a few times Googled some of the names that people were bringing up, and I came across the wiki page for this series, which I found very helpful just to kind of explain who some of these people were or what certain phrases referred to. So yeah, I will say first up, the magic system is pretty cool from what I've seen so far, although I can't claim to understand all of it yet. It is pretty complicated and confusing, but my understanding of it is that basically people can use magic in this world, some people, but the magic doesn't come from them. Instead, they draw the magic from these things called warrens, which are kind of like another magical realm or dimension, which are often ruled by a magical god who can sort of grant people powers. And different gods will have different conditions under which they will give people powers. So one of the gods that is featured in this book is the god of shadows, called Shadow Throne. He's like a god of deception, trickery, darkness, who was a pretty cool character that one of the characters deals with. Also, this Shadow Throne god, he has some sort of magical familiars called hounds, just sort of these godly magical dogs that are very similar to hellhounds, I would think. They're also super powerful. And a few of the chapters are actually from the perspective of one of these hounds, a hound named Gear, which was pretty cool. It was quite interesting to be chucked inside the mind of this monstrous super dog. It was quite enjoyable. Then, for example, one of the other gods who hasn't appeared yet, but who has been referred to, is the god of death named Hood, who is super powerful. Yeah, so that's a bit of the magic system. So there's also a lot going on here about sort of imperial politics and conflict. There's definitely scheming and political chess going on here, which will fans of Game of Thrones will enjoy that. Just in general, I think this series will appeal to people who like Game of Thrones because this series is quite gritty and brutal, like Game of Thrones was, which is actually one of the main things I enjoyed. about Gardens of the Moon. I've read quite a few of the books in Brandon Sanderson's Way of Kings series, which I've also enjoyed, but one thing I kind of don't really like about that series is that it's a bit too PG, if you know what I mean. Like, it's just not, like, that harsh or brutal. Sometimes it almost seems like it's written for kids rather than adults. But that's not the case with Gardens of the Moon. Gardens of the Moon is pretty brutal. There's, like, death, mayhem, slavery, torture, psychological trauma. It's just a pretty harsh world that these people live in. Yeah, and I mean, also, like Game of Thrones, so far it seems like the characters are all morally shades of grey, which I appreciate a lot about this. There aren't any people who are just straight up evil. Like the Empress of the Malazan Empire, a figure called Lassine, is pretty hectic and, like, has lots of people murdered and causes all sorts of bad things, but not because she's evil, but because she believes that these things will serve her goals. So apparently that's something that the author did deliberately, like he really wanted to have complex characters, not simply heroes or villains, and, he succeeds, which I respect. So the author is a Canadian named Stephen Erikson, but he's also worked on this series with one of his friends called Ian C. Esselmont. So actually this series started off as a role-playing campaign that the two of them, played with in the 1980s. Yeah, which is pretty cool. So basically they just created this world and these countries and histories just as the backdrop for the RPG, the tabletop RPG they were playing in the 80s. Then in the 90s, they took that world that they had created and they turned it into a movie script, which they pitched to some production companies, got rejected by everyone. So then eventually they converted that script into a book, this book, which they published in 1999. And it's ended up becoming a pretty successful and well-reviewed series. So there are 10 books in the main series, and the series has been completed. So, fans don't have to worry about having a situation like Game of Thrones or The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, where they're just waiting years and years and years for books that possibly will never come out. So there are 10 books in the main series here, but then there are also some other spin-off books. So I think there are a total of 16 books in the universe published so far, with more to come. What else can I say about it? I mean, yeah, look, I thought the book was well written, interesting characters, interesting magic system, quite a unique magical world, but still hitting, those classic notes that, you like. I mean, battle mages, dragons, zombies, giants, kingdoms at war with each other, political scheming. It's, there's lots of classic fantasy tropes here, but the author also, puts a fresh spin on these tropes, kind of like flips some of them upside down, which is apparently something the author has tried deliberately to do. So yeah, long story short, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I would highly recommend it for anyone who's into fantasy and is looking for a new good fantasy book to read. As I said, the book is kind of a little bit beginner unfriendly in that it really throws you into the middle of the story and doesn't hold your hand or like fully explain everything, but that's actually kind of what's cool about it. I mean, this is a book that respects the reader's intelligence. It's an adult book. It's for a serious adult fantasy fan. So yeah, if you fit into that category, you'll probably enjoy this book. If you've read any other cool fantasy books, please let me know, or if you have thoughts on the series, I'd be keen to hear that. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.